Caro with c6, d4, d5 is known as one of black's most solid lines against 1e4 and is notoriously difficult to break down. At club level, it might be played by the old chap with the pipe who just sits there and waits for you to impale yourself on his rock-like defensive wall. I've played against guys like this myself. You can find them at every level of competitive chess. The way to beat them is with the move 3f3, which is one of the best kept secrets in the modern game, known only to attack-minded GMs such as David Bronstein, Joe Gallagher and Julian Hodgson. It used to be known as the fantasy variation, but I prefer to call it the Caro Krusher. The move 3f3 would certainly have warmed the heart of that great classical chess thinker Wilhelm Steinitz, because white simply supports this pawn on e4, which together with the pawn on d4 makes up a broad pawn centre. Now this f3 move might seem quite extravagant, but after black has played this passive move c6, it's well and truly possible. Black has three main plans in this position. The first one is to try to smash open the position with either e5 or d takes e4, and after f takes e4 then play e5. And this is the first plan that I'm going to look at. In the second section I'll be looking at the move e6, which frees up this bishop on f8 and incidentally threatens d takes e4, and after f takes e4 the horrible move queen h4 check. Finally, we'll take a look at another solid continuation for black, the move g6, which combines keeping the position closed with putting this bishop on g7 from where it pressurises the d4 square. Against each of these modes of development, I'm going to show you what I think is the most effective setup for white. The only other move to see the light of day for black has been the move knight f6. But this is really a second-rate reply because white can play e5, and after knight g8 I think that white can play a very powerful move in this position with c4. And if black takes this, d takes c4, white plays bishop takes c4, and will then follow up with a pattern of development with knight c3, knight ge2, and probably bring this bishop out to e3, obtaining a real grip in the middle of the board. The immediate e5 by black is the kind of gambit treatment that no Caro player would really ever dream of. But occasionally you might have to meet this, so I'm going to show you what Joe Gallagher does, and something that he's won a lot of games with in fact. He plays d takes e5, and after bishop c5, which is really black's only logical move, he plays his knight out to c3, attacking this pawn on d5. Now black's move here is queen out to b6, but then white reveals the point of his idea by allowing this check on f2 and going knight a4. If black then goes bishop f2 check, white plays the move king e2, and now there's no square for this queen on b6 to go to and still protect the bishop on f2 without going to d4, which would allow the exchange of queens in a position in which white is simply a pawn up. After this move knight a4, black therefore has to play queen a5 check, and then c3 will leave black faced with the threats both of b4 and knight takes bishop on c5. Joe Gallagher's had this position on a couple of occasions. The first one was against Mr. Anich in Lyon 1993. And Mr. Anich took this knight on g1 with his bishop on c5. Joe replied simply with rook takes g1, and after d takes e4, he developed his queen's bishop with bishop f4. Now white is already well ahead in development. After knight e7, Joe took this pawn on e4, fe, black castled, and now he played b4, which really leaves black's queen with no terribly good square, because if he goes back to c7, white can plonk his queen on d6 with queen d6. In fact, Anich was reduced to going queen back to d8, but then queen takes d8, rook takes d8, left him not only a pawn down in this endgame, but white also has a very strong pair of bishops. Not surprisingly, white went on to win. Gallagher's second opponent in this position was the Russian Grandmaster Vladimir Tukmakov, and they played a game in Geneva 1994 in which Tukmakov, instead of taking this knight on g1 with this bishop on c5, retreated the bishop all the way back to f8. Black is actually threatening to trap this knight on a4 now with the move b5. So white has to act fast. Joe played the move b4 himself, and after the queen came back to c7, he captured this pawn on d5. Tukmakov took the pawn on e5 with check, and after queen e2, black found himself facing an endgame in which he'd have an isolated pawn after queen takes e2 check, knight takes e2, and now c takes d5. Rather than defend such a passive position, Tukmakov decided to sacrifice a pawn with knight f6. But this was a rather strange decision, because after d takes c6, knight takes c6, he'd never had anything like enough compensation, and white went on to win in 48 moves. A more common way to lash out with e5 is by first taking this pawn on e4, d takes e4, and after fe, only then playing e5. Now this threatens queen h4 check, which white really has to do something about. So he develops this knight out to f3. We then come to a major parting of the ways, in which black can take this pawn on d4, and he can also develop his bishop on c8, either to e6 or to g4. After bishop g4, the reply bishop out to c4 actually threatens bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, knight takes e5 check, simultaneously attacking black's king and this bishop on g4. However black defends against this threat to his f7 square, either with bishop h5 or knight d7, white is going to adopt the same kind of plan. He'll play c3, castle short, and perhaps bring his knight out to d2, and in either case he's going to have a really nice attacking position with a broad pawn centre, pawns on e4 and d4, and his bishop lurking on this a2 g8 diagonal. Last but not least, he has an open f-file, and this rook on f1, gazing towards the f7 square, makes the position look more like a king's gambit than a Caro-Kann defence. Theory recommends that black actually stop white's bishop coming out to c4 by going bishop e6 himself first. At the moment, white still can't take this pawn on e5 with his knight because of knight takes e5, queen h4 check, once again attacking white's king and this pawn on e4. White should therefore support his centre with the move c3, after which knight d7, bishop d3, bishop d6, castles kingside, once again gives us a position in which white's rook is lurking on f1 on this open f file. Black actually has quite a serious problem in this position, because if he continues developing naturally with knight gf6, then white can play the move knight g5, hitting this bishop on e6. Now if the bishop comes out to g4, then white can follow up with queen b3, attacking the pawn on f7, which would be mate, and also the pawn on b7. When faced with this problem, most blacks have resorted to the incredibly ugly f6, and this in fact is what Vlastimil Hort, a famous grandmaster, did against a little-known opponent Jimenez in Moscow 1963. This game continued bishop e3, knight e7. Jimenez brought his knight out to d2, supporting the centre, knight bd2, bishop c7, and now white exchanged off this light squared bishop on e6, which is covering some valuable squares, with bishop c4. Hort took the bishop, bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, and now because of the pressure that white's developing, Hort felt obliged to take this pawn on d4, e takes d4. And after knight takes d4, he defended the e6 square with knight back to f8. Well, this game must have been really humiliating for Hort, because after queen h5 check, g6, queen back to f3, the grandmaster had to retreat his other knight, and he went knight g8. Jimenez, needless to say, smashed him flat. After bishop e6, c3, a better move for black than knight d7 is to bring his other knight out to f6. I then recommend that white should take this pawn on e5 with knight takes e5. And after knight takes e4, just drop this knight back to f3. This was played in a game Guin and Garcia Palermo, Brussels 1986, which now continued bishop e7, bishop d3, the knight dropped back to d6, and white castled. And once again, taking a look at this position, we see that it resembles a king's gambit more than a boring old Caro-Kann defence, because white's got these open e and f files which give him tremendous attacking chances. This is not the kind of stodge that Caro-Kann players dream about. Rather than let white reinforce his centre with the move c3, many blacks prefer to take off this pawn on d4, e takes d4. White then plays his bishop out to c4, after which this bishop, combined with a rook coming to f1 after white castles kingside, will build up tremendously dangerous pressure against black's pawn on f7. Just how dangerous this can be was shown in two games which actually followed an identical path. In both cases, black was mated on move 14. Black played bishop out to b4 check, white answered with c3. Black then took this pawn on c3, and white now played bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, queen takes d8, capturing black's queen, but allowing another queen to appear after c takes b2 check, king e2, b takes a1, queen. At this moment, black is a whole rook and bishop ahead. But in both games, white had the last laugh with knight g5 check, king came up to g6, queen e8 check, king came to h6, Knight e6 check gave discovered check from this bishop on c1, g5, and now bishop takes g5 was mate. Caro crushed. Instead of bishop b4 check, Yasser Seirawan played queen a5 check in his game against Fritzinger in Lone Pine 1976. Well, white played in thematic gambit style with c3, and now rather than take this pawn on c3, Seirawan started to develop his kingside with bishop e7. Fritzinger actually stopped black's knight coming out to f6 with the move e5. And after d takes c3, knight takes c3, Seirawan's knight d7 was met by the very surprising bishop takes f7 check. Seirawan took the bishop, king takes f7, but after e6 check, he decided that discretion was the better part of valour, and he retreated his king to e8, e takes d7 check, bishop takes d7, and now white castled kingside. Well, this position's really very uncomfortable for black, because he can no longer castle, and his poor king on e8 is condemned to wandering around the centre, possibly for the rest of the game. Seirawan drew this game, but that might well be because he was Seirawan, rather than any merits of his position. The sensible thing for black to do is to develop his kingside, but how exactly is he going to do this? If he plays, for example, bishop c5, white's reply, castles, is suddenly bringing even more force to bear against this pawn on f7. If black were then to bring his knight out to f6, white could play knight g5, and after castles, go e5, knight d5, queen h5, suddenly attacking both his pawn on h7 and the one on f7. After white's castles, in one game Levitsky-Izbinsky, St. Petersburg 1905, black defended against one of these knight lunges, knight g5 or perhaps knight e5, with the odd move f6. Well, this is really asking for it, and white delivered with knight e5. Black took the knight, and after queen h5 check, decided to head for the hills with king d7. The game continued queen takes e5, bishop d6, queen takes g7 check, and now knight e7 was forced. White brought in more pieces still with bishop g5, and after king c7, the move rook f7 forced rook e8. White brought in even more reinforcements with e5, bishop c5, knight d2, intending, for example, knight e4, or to activate this rook on a1. Although black's a piece up, I don't know many people that would enjoy his position. In order to neutralise this massive bishop on c4, a lot of blacks have been tempted into playing bishop out to e6. However, after bishop takes e6, fe, black is still way behind in development, and he's also got a lot of weaknesses now. After castles, knight d7, Julian Hodgson won a game very quickly with knight g5, queen e7, knight f7. This simply wins material, and black actually gave up his queen with queen takes f7, rook takes f7, but was forced to resign after a mere 21 moves. Tartakova won a game even faster than Julian in a tournament in Budapest 1929, when after bishop takes e6, fe, castles, his opponent played the move bishop e7. The game continued knight takes d4, queen d7, queen h5 check. And because g6 will be met by queen e5, Black felt obliged to move his king away with king d8. The game continued bishop e3, c5, and now Tartakova exploited the fact that Black's queen and king are both on the d-file with a move rook d1. And after c takes d4, rook d4, bishop d6, he went e5, winning this bishop on d6 back, and also keeping a tremendous attack against Black's king in the centre. In a game Murray-Kalechevich, Zurich 1991, Black played bishop e7, and after castles, played this odd-looking move f6, which we've seen before. In this game, Murray simply captured the pawn on d4 with knight takes d4. And after c5, knight b5, a6, Murray got the better endgame with queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, rook d1 check, knight d7, and now Murray brought the knight back to c3 from where it will jump into d5 on a later date. For those of you who might be disappointed with an endgame advantage after the series of bloodbaths we've just witnessed, I recommend the move c3, and after dc you can go queen e2. If Black now plays c takes b2, bishop takes b2, White has got really tremendous development and is getting ready to smash Black flat in the centre with e5. The best line for Black, relatively speaking, is to play bishop e7, castles, knight f6. And in fact these moves bishop e7 and knight f6 can be played in either order. White should now play knight g5, and after castles he slaughters this pawn on f7 with knight takes f7. If Black now captures the knight with rook takes f7, White recaptures, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and now White wins this knight on f6 with the move e5. The net result of all of this is that White simply wins the exchange. Black's king goes back to g8, White takes on f6, and Black recaptures. And now White is the one with all the chances. After knight d2, the best move for Black is to play his queen out to d5 in order to stop this white knight from coming into e4. White should play queen e2, and after bishop e6 his knight comes to e4 in any case. After Black defends this bishop on f6 with knight d7, White can choose between bringing his bishop out to f4 or even bringing it out to g5, because bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, queen takes g5 allows queen takes e6 check. In all these lines, Black is struggling for a miserable half point. Instead of giving up the exchange by taking this knight on f7, there is one game in which Black played queen a5. a game Kuhn-Grafvol, Bundesliga 1985-86. Now this game went knight d6 check, discovered check from the bishop on c4, king h8, knight takes c8, rook takes c8, white brought his rook into play with rook f5, and now black played queen b4, hitting this bishop on c4. Now in the game, white played knight d2, but I prefer dropping this bishop back immediately with bishop d3, so as to play e5 on the next move. Now Kuhn actually lost this game, but I think if he'd have played my bishop d3, he would have got a very strong attack. Summing up, I think the attempt by black to exploit the move f3 with de, fe, e5 rebounds on him because of the weakness of this f7 square. After knight f3, black's best shot is to play the bishop out to e6 in order to stop white's bishop coming to c4. But we've seen that this too doesn't manage to equalise for black. Black's most popular move at the highest levels is e6, after which white used to play bishop e3 in the early days of f3. But that was before he discovered that knight c3 is by far the strongest move. And it leaves black with a major choice between knight f6 and bishop out to b4, both of which put pressure on this e4 pawn. The only other move to really challenge white's pawn centre is c5, but this simply loses a pawn to e takes d5, ed, and now dc. Black really can't recapture this pawn on c5 because the one on d5 is hanging. The move bishop e7 is rather too passive in my opinion, and white could for example play just bishop e3, getting ready to go queen d2 and even castle's queenside. Another interesting possibility for white is knight ge2, and this was in fact played in a game Carr-Miles British Championship 1988, which featured a major upset in that white beat his illustrious opponent. Miles played de, and after fe, we once again saw white having this massive pawn centre with pawns on d4 and e4. Miles tried to disturb them with c5, only to have the reply d5 set up a dangerous passed pawn. Miles brought his knight out to f6, but then bishop f4 threatened to push this d-pawn onto d6. This position was already getting quite desperate for black. He went queen b6, and after d6 retreated his bishop to d8. But white already stood very well, and this pawn on d6 is a bone in black's throat. Another rather passive move for black is b6, and this was played in a game Vole-Gibbons, Sydney 1989. This game went on bishop e3, bishop a6, knight ge2, black brought his knight out with knight f6, white played queen d2 in preparation for castling queenside, and once again black gave up the centre with d takes e4, fe, bishop b4, hoping to snaffle this white pawn off on e4. However, white spotted the threat and went knight g3, simply defending it. And after bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, castles, white castled queenside, with really a very promising attacking position. Before moving on to black's most important options, I should mention the move queen b6, which attempts to tie white's bishop on c1 down to the defence of the pawn on b2. A game Smyslov Floor, USSR Championship 1949 in Moscow, continued with knight ge2, knight f6, queen d3. After knight a6, Smyslov defended against the threat of knight b4 with a3. Black played c5, trying to disturb White's powerful pawn centre, and White now pushed on with e5, knight d7, f4. What we have is an unusual kind of French defence, with Black's knight misplaced on a6, and White enjoying more space. Smyslov eventually won this game after a difficult struggle. This Smyslov Floor game is also quite important because after knight f6, the move I recommend for White, which is knight g to e2, can be met by queen out to b6, which would in fact transpose directly. Black could consider other options, such as bishop e7. And then I think a good plan for White is bishop e3, followed by queen d2, and castles queenside. In such a position, White's plan would be to gradually advance on the king side, perhaps with h3 followed by g4. It's not so easy in such positions for Black to break out with c5, because White's pawn, by staying on e4, maintains the pressure on Black's d5 square. After knight f6, the move knight ge2 is very little explored and offers a very interesting field for investigation. White's most usual response to knight f6 has been to go e5, after which knight fd7, f4, c5 transposes, amazingly enough, into a variation of the French defence, in which both sides have lost a tempo. White went f3 to f4, and Black went c6 to c5. Instead of knight f6, Black's most popular option is to bring the bishop out to b4. And this in fact renews Black's threat of d takes e4, fe, queen h4 check, attacking this e4 pawn because the bishop on b4 pins the knight on c3. This is actually one of the most critical positions in the f3 Caro-Kann, and the theory is still developing. White can defend against this threat to his e4 pawn in a number of ways, and out of these I'm going to look at bishop f4, queen d3, and knight ge2, all of which are quite promising and lead to very interesting chess. After knight g2, Black could play knight out to f6, or even bring the knight out to e7. But after a3, White drives back this bishop from b4 and still maintains his central pawns on e4 and d4. I think the critical line after this move knight g2 is to play de, fe, and now bring the queen out to h4 check. White must play knight g3 in order to defend his e4 pawn. Black then renews the attack on this pawn with knight out to f6. White can defend it one more time with the move queen f3. But what I recommend is that he pushes it on with e5. Black can reply to this with the amazing knight e4, when both this knight on g3 and the one on c3 are pinned by Black's queen and bishop respectively. One way for White to get out of this is by going queen h5. And after queen takes h5, knight takes h5, knight takes c3, he can recover his piece with a3, bishop a5, and now bishop d2, when the knight on c3 is pinned against the bishop on a5. This fascinating plan was played in a game between Bjarke Christensen and Johannesson in Gausdal 1995, and the sheer brinkmanship of the idea is guaranteed to give the average Caro Kann player a heart attack. In fact, it's not only a question of brinkmanship, as after castles, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3 check, bc, white's knight on h5 puts unpleasant pressure on black's king side, and white might try to intensify that pressure, say by castles, followed by rook d3, and then swinging the rook across over to g3. Instead of Christensen's fascinating queen h5, David Bronstein played queen d3 in his game against Harriet Hunt in the Vera Menchik Memorial Tournament in Maidstone 1994. Black captured this knight on g3, Bronstein took back with his queen, and after queen takes d4, he took this pawn off on g7. Black captured on c3, check. After bc, he took with his queen, and now white's king started a march with king f2. Black's rook came to f8. White played bishop h6. Black defended the rook on f8 with knight d7. And now white continued his development with bishop out to d3. When black started attacking white's king on f2 with a move f6, things got really interesting. White brought his rook over from a1 to e1. Black played b6, getting ready to develop this bishop on c8 and castle queenside. Bronstein took the pawn on h7 with his queen. Black played queen d4 check, and now the king came up the board with king g3. After the further moves, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, a brilliant coup, queen takes e5 check, bishop f4. Harriet Hunt pinned this bishop on d3 with a move queen c3. Bronstein now played a really amazing move to escape this pin. He brought his king up to h4, which threatens bishop g6 check. Black played f5, but then the bishop switched to another diagonal with bishop e2. Black's queen came back to f6 check. Bronstein played king h3. And now the rook came to f7, trying to drive away white's queen. Bronstein's bishop came up to h5 to pin the rook. Black played king e7. And now came the exquisite finale. Bishop takes f7. Queen takes f7. Bishop d6 check. King f6. Queen h6 check. Queen g6. And now bishop e7 check, forced resignation. Because the king can't take the bishop, black's queen on g6 is en prise, and king f7 is met by queen f8 mate. A really brilliant game by the former world title contender. After knight ge2, the kind of sabre dance that we've just seen is really more or less forced from black's point of view, unless he wants to go into a really passive position. If these complications are too much for you as white, then you might consider going either bishop f4 or queen d3. Now this move queen d3 hasn't been tried too much yet, but I think we may be seeing a lot more of it in the future. One of white's ideas will be to go bishop d2 followed by castling queenside. Another one is that the queen may be usefully placed on the third rank should black play DE, FE. This queen may later swing across to the king's side, either G3 or H3, and harass a black monarch should it be castled there. Murray's move is bishop F4, which has become established as the main line for white. Black then has a major choice between putting his knight on F6 and on E7. An interesting example of knight E7 occurred in the game Murray-Kharitonov, Moscow 1989, in which white now played knight E2. After castles, white played A3, black's bishop came back to A5, and now Murray played queen D3, which intends to castle queenside in some positions. Black played knight D7, white played his bishop into D6, Kharitonov chased it away with bishop C7. We got an exchange of bishops, bishop takes C7, queen takes C7, and now Murray castled queenside, which left us with a very sharp game indeed. White's plan in this position is to launch an attack against the enemy king, and he'll do this with something like H4, H5, H6, perhaps bringing his queen to E3, and trying to provoke weaknesses on the dark squares around black's king. Instead of knight E7, black can also put this knight on F6, which leads to similar play after queen D3, B6, knight E2, bishop A6, queen E3, castles long. Once again we've got one of these razor sharp opposite side castling positions, in which the first person to land the attack is going to win. The stem game in this variation, Murray-Sadie, New York 1989, continued knight BD7, H3, another possibility for white here was king B1, rook C8, A3, bishop takes C3, knight takes C3, bishop takes F1, white recaptured the bishop on F1 with his H-rook, and now black trying to lash out on the queen side with B5. Unfortunately for him, white had got too much control over the position. He now went bishop D6, not only hitting this rook on F8, but covering some of these dark squares on the queen side. The rook came to E8, white played E5, black's knight came to B6, with the idea that if white takes this knight on F6, his bishop on D6 hangs. White played B3, stopping this black knight from coming to C4. Black's knight on F6 came back to D7. But now white sounded the advance on the F file by going F4. Black played rook A8, and now knight E2, A5, queen C3, queen C8, F5 launched the attack proper, and black lost this game very quickly. He played EF, queen came back to F3, black played knight F8, and now came the magnificent G4. Black's knight came to E6, GF, the knight came to G5, but this position is really getting desperate for black now. White played queen H5, and after knight E4 he pushed on with F6. Only a couple more moves were needed. G takes F6, rook takes F6, and after knight takes D6, black simultaneously resigned. Black's position is really hopeless, after either e takes d6 or rook takes d6, his kingside being completely smashed. To summarise this section, I would say that e6, knight c3, bishop b4 may well be black's best shot against the f3 Caro Krusher, and I would assess these positions as being dynamically equal. But looking at it from a practical point of view, the razor-sharp positions we have just examined may not be to black's taste. Finally, we come to the move 3g6, which attempts to combine the solidity of keeping this pawn on d5 with pressure against white's pawn on d4 from a bishop coming to the g7 square. White should play knight c3, and then after bishop g7 he can bring his bishop out to e3 in preparation for queen d2 and castling long. After bishop e3, black has sometimes played the move queen b6, which tries to tie white down to the defence of this b2 pawn. White should gambit this pawn with queen d2, and after queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3, he actually recovers his pawn with e takes d5. A game Hodgson-Fuller from the 1990 Novi Sad Olympiad now continued knight out to f6, d takes c6, b takes c6, and now Hodgson developed his king's bishop on an active square with the move bishop c4. Black castled. White brought his knight out to e2 in preparation for castling himself. Black played knight bd7. And now after bishop b3, bishop a6 castles. I think that white's slightly better. His pieces are a little bit more actively placed than their black counterparts. Instead of queen b6, black actually played queen a5 in a game Aaron Sibir, Bass, Leon 1990. Now, white did something really inexplicable now. He played e takes d5, c takes d5, giving up his proud pawn centre. I simply can't understand how white can do such a thing when there seem to be perfectly good moves like queen d2 around, intending perhaps castling queenside, and all the time maintaining these pawns on d4 and e4. I honestly don't see the point of queen a5 either. Instead of one of these sallies with black's queen, black has played the move e6, which is ultra solid, bordering on the turgid. A game Or Je Duel from the Saloniki Olympiad in 1988 continued now with queen d2, knight d7, white castle queenside, and now black lashed out with b5. White played ed, black also played ed, and now after rook e1, knight e7, bishop g5, f6, white played the remarkable sacrifice bishop takes b5. One of the ideas of this move is that after f takes g5, white can play bishop takes c6, attacking this rook on a8 and simultaneously threatening knight takes d5, attacking the knight on e7. In the game, black played bishop out to b7, which maintains the attack on both of white's bishops. Or played bishop back to f4. After cb, he played his bishop into d6, and after bishop f8, he played knight takes b5. Instead of e6, Black played the incredibly strange bishop out to e6, and a game between Klip and Gelbke, Dutch Team Championship 1994. It's quite difficult to prove something in closed positions like this, but Black's pieces are on very odd squares and he doesn't have much space. The game went on Queen d2, Knight f6, Knight ge2. Now Black brought his knight out to the square a6, but after e5, Knight d7, Knight f4, I really didn't like his position, even if he did go on to win the game in the end. I think that the eventual result of this game might have more to do with the fact that Black is a stronger player rather than any particular merits in his position at this time. The most popular move for Black is to take on e4, and after de, fe, to develop the knight on f6. White should then bring his knight out to f3, reaching a critical position for the theory of this 3g6 line. One of the moves available for Black is Knight g4, after which White has a pleasant choice between bishop f4 and bishop g5. An example of this latter move was a remarkable game between Joe Gallagher and Tony Miles, played in London 1984. This game continued h6, bishop h4. Miles's knight jumped into e3 with knight e3. After queen d2, Miles took off an f1 with knight takes f1. Gallagher recaptured on f1 with his rook. Bishop e6. Gallagher castled queenside. Miles brought his queen out to a5. Gallagher played d5, hitting this bishop on e6. The bishop came out to g4, but then Gallagher hit it again with queen out to f4. Miles played h5. Now Gallagher played a really remarkable move. He went knight e5, launching a ferocious attack. I'll show you how this game finished, because it was really fantastic. Bishop h6, bishop g5, bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. Miles took off this rook on d1, bishop takes d1, but Gallagher had the last word with the incredible d6, e takes d6, and now he sacrificed a knight as well with knight d5, threatening mate with queen e7. Miles took this knight off as well, cd, going several pieces up, but then Gallagher took this pawn on f7 with his rook on f1, rook takes f7. The threat of mate on e7 can only be defended with knight out to c6. But then Gallagher left his opponent defenceless with the move queen f6, threatening queen e6 check and also queen takes h8 mate. Miles found himself with little choice but to resign. A really fantastic achievement by Gallagher. Instead of Gallagher's bishop g5, the move bishop f4 also proved exciting in a game Rodriguez-Adianto, Jakarta Zonal 1993. In this game, Adianto played c5, White replied with knight d5, and now Black castled, trying to tempt White into invading the c7 square with his knight. He didn't do it immediately, but first hit Black's knight on g4 with the move h3. Black then hit White's knight on d5 with e6. The knight came into c7, and then Black hit this bishop on f4 with a move e5. A real slugfest followed. First of all, White captured this rook on a8, knight takes a8. Black captured the bishop on f4 with ef. White captured this knight on g4 with hg. And then Black recaptured. Bishop takes g4. It's very difficult to assess this position. Black is actually a whole rook down at the moment, but probably is going to pick up this knight on a8, and his bishop looks very strong on g7. White actually won this game, but it was only after a very long and complicated struggle. I don't think this move knight g4 is really a very good idea. And I don't think that queen b6, attacking this pawn on b2, is too good either. White should make a gambit of it once again with the move queen d2, after which a game Ochoa Sanchez, Spanish Team Championship Linares 1991, continued knight g4, bishop f4, black snatched this pawn with queen takes b2, white played rook b1, the queen had to go to a3, white hit this knight on g4 with the move h3, the knight retreated, and now white landed his own knight in the centre with knight e5, which actually threatens to trap black's queen with knight c4. The queen retreated to a5, after which bishop c4 hit the f7 square. Black castled, and white also castled. And looking at this position, we see that although black is a pawn up, he's under tremendous pressure from the active white pieces. In particular, the f7 pawn is being eyed by this knight on e5, the bishop on c4, and the rook on f1. I would prefer to play white. He's got more than enough compensation for the pawn, and in the game he went on to win in a mere 28 moves. I got this position as white against Gert Pieterse in the 1990 Ramata tournament. In this game my opponent played much more sensibly, with castles kingside. I played queen d2, lining up the queen and bishop for an eventual bishop h6. And my opponent now played the move b5. If instead of this move b5, black had played knight g4, then my intention was to play bishop out to g5, and after f6, go bishop c4 check, king h8, and now h3, hitting the knight on g4. After the further moves f takes g5, h takes g4, white has opened up this h-file for his rook on h1, and he now threatens knight takes g5, hitting the pawn on h7. I doubt very much that black could survive such a position for very long. After Pieterse's b5, black threatens to go b4, which drives away the knight on c3, which protects the pawn on e4. Therefore I defended it with bishop out to d3. And now once again, black could have considered playing the move knight g4. Against this move, bishop out to g5 is not as good as it was last time, because now black can play f6, and I no longer have bishop c4 check available because of this pawn on b5. Instead of this, my intention was simply to let black take this bishop on e3 if he wants to, by going castles long. Even though black removes this dark squared bishop with knight takes e3, queen takes e3, white has completed his development and is ready to start attacking black with h4, h5. I think that in spite of the loss of the bishop pair, this position is very strong for white, who's got a tremendous initiative on the king side. Instead of knight g4, Pieterse came up with the move a6, which in my view is far too passive, considering we're about to get an opposite side castling situation. I exchanged off his bishop on g7 with the move bishop h6. Pieterse brought his own bishop out to g4. I lopped off the bishop on g7, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and now I played e5, driving another defender, this knight on f6, away from the defence of his monarch. The knight came to d5. I brought another piece over to the attack with knight e4. Peter completed his development with knight d7, but already the storm clouds were gathering round black's kingside. I played h4, which has got the idea of charging with h5 on the next move, sacrificing a pawn if necessary. Rather than allow this to happen, black stopped it with his own h5. But now I angled for the advance g4 with a move knight h2. And after the bishop dropped back to f5, I played g4 immediately. Black took this pawn on g4, and now I cut loose with a move h5. Black played e6, wanting to play queen h4 check, but white got his king away with castle's queenside. Facing a growing dark square bind in the vicinity of his king, black played the move f6, trying to challenge white's centre, in particular this pawn on e5. But I now went rook d to g1, hitting this pawn on g4. Peter took my knight off on e4, hoping that after bishop takes e4, the move f5 would construct a blockade on the king side. But I now rocked him back with knight takes g4, leaving both this bishop en prise on e4 and putting a new piece en prise on g4. White's threat of queen h6 check stops black from capturing this bishop on e4. If he eliminates the knight with fg, then rook takes g4 would crash through on the king side, this pawn on g6 falling next move. My opponent desperately tried to fend off the threats with rook h8. But now I finished him off with bishop takes d5, and after cd, the knight on g4 jumped into f6. Black took it off with knight takes f6, but now rook takes g6 check, king f7, rook takes f6 check, king e7, queen b4 check, finished the game immediately. Peter resigned rather than face king d7, queen d6 check, king c8, when white starts eating all these pawns on e6, then f5 and maybe d5 as well. Against the g6 line, white has got a very promising attacking formation in knight c3, bishop e3, queen d2, followed by castle's queenside, and later on he's going to try and inflict carnage on black's game with h4, h5. Before bringing my discussion of 3g6 to a close, I should mention another interesting try for black, which tries to avoid this dangerous white plan. After knight c3, Bogdan Lalic against Jan Timman in the Moscow Olympiad in 1994 played the move knight out to h6, which has the idea that after bishop e3, black wants to take this pawn on e4, and after fe, hit the bishop on e3 with a move knight g4. The point of all this is that white isn't ready for knight g4 at the moment, and if he goes, for example, bishop f4, black can hit him with e5. It's also not good for white to play bishop g5, because then black's got a flashy trick in f6, and if bishop h4, he can play knight e3, queen d2, queen takes d4, winning a pawn. The point is that queen takes d4 can be met by knight takes c2 check, and next move black will get back his queen with knight takes d4. This is why Timman played his bishop out to f4 instead. And then Lalic played the odd-looking move f6, but sometimes he's going to want to play e5, hitting the bishop on f4. Timman now played an interesting plan, tried to drive black's knight on b8 to an awkward square. He went ed, and after cd, played knight b5, threatening to come into c7 check with the knight. This forced Lalich to play knight a6, and now queen d2, knight f7, c3, left black's pieces on funny squares, but he had a solid position. This game resulted in a draw in 24 moves. Instead of either bishop f4 or bishop e3, I think white might do well to consider the move knight g to e2, and only on his next go bishop e3. This would have the advantage that if black would then play d takes e4, fe, knight g4, white could drop this bishop back to the g1 square. Both sides clearly have many different possible arrangements for their pieces, and this is why the position is so rich and interesting to play. There's really something I quite like about this move f3, and the way that it supports white's classical pawn duo on e4 and d4. In these lines we've just looked at, with g6, knight out to c3, it doesn't seem to me as if black really gets enough pressure against white's centre, and he's in danger of either drifting into a passive position or getting cut to ribbons on the king side. In any case, he certainly doesn't get the kind of dull technical game that most Caro Kann players seem to dream about. The move 3f3 is favoured by masters and grandmasters who open 1e4 because they want a sharp, uncompromising struggle and don't want the boredom of a conventional Caro. I think you'll agree from what I've shown you that white has excellent chances to fight for the initiative, and if black doesn't know exactly what he's doing, he can very easily be crushed.